We have 4 wonderful presentations, which I'm very excited about because there's such a range of topics that will be covered in it today. And I think we will go in that same order based on our panel sort of information. You will have about 10 to 12 minutes to present. We'll be timing you and just kind of giving you a 1-minute warning before at the very end. Let's start with our very own Dr. Vickie Tyler Carnegie, our Interim MPA Program Director at Old Dominion University, with her insights about effects of COVID on teaching. Vickie, take it away.
Good morning. I am pleased to speak with you today regarding teaching during COVID-19, avoiding exhaustion while employing kindness, empathy, and rigor in public service education. COVID-19 released a havoc of economic, social, physical, and psychological stressors worldwide. In the Hampton Roads area, the Hampton Roads Planning District Commission reports 333,029 COVID-19 cases, with 11,171 hospitalizations and 3,695 deaths. Considering their pro-social behavior and motivations, public service students and professionals are on the front lines of the COVID-19 crisis. According to researchers Johnson, Ibrahimi, and Koffi, those who work in public service during this pandemic have proven to be associated with heightened cases of mental health problems, such as post-traumatic stress disorder, anxiety, and depression. The ambitious demands and objectives of the public service field, as outlined in the ASPA Code of Ethics, necessitate that kindness and empathy be coupled with rigor to ensure that public service professionals are responsive to citizens' needs and provide efficient, effective programs and services. I completed an integrative literature review of articles related to public service professionals, students, and instructors during the COVID-19 pandemic. Additionally, I examined instructional strategies related to kindness and empathy to answer the research question of what instructional strategies should educators employ to increase kindness and empathy in the public service classroom. The COVID-19 pandemic created a need for kindness and empathy in public service instruction. Research shows that students are profoundly impacted by the ravages of COVID-19, with one recent study of 15,000 graduate students revealing that 32% had worsening symptoms of depression and 39% had elevated anxiety symptoms during the pandemic. For the public service student, these stressors include concern for personal health and safety while providing care and services to the public, grieving the loss of family and friends, economic uncertainty, and the isolation that comes and is associated with social distancing, burnout, and fatigue. And for students, the fear of falling behind academically. Such stressors increase episodes of mental health problems, especially for those suffering with previous medical conditions, who have a history of mental illness or who have poor social support. For this research, I define kindness as being generous, helpful, and thinking or concerned about the feelings of others. According to clinical therapist Robert Chuckman, kindness creates feelings of well-being and trust that are necessary for the recovery from trauma. Kindness can be used for the purposeful engagement of complex, positive positive emotions that facilitate deep social connections and resolve that social disconnectedness that lies at the heart of traumatic stress. Researchers Myers, Rowell, Wells, and Smith define empathy as the degree to which an instructor works to deeply understand students, their personal and social situations, and then to respond compassionately without losing the focus on student learning. Empathy fosters tools to be effective change makers. The primary goals of empathy and kindness in the classroom are to promote community and belonging. My research reveals several instructional strategies which could serve to reduce belonging uncertainty, which has increased during COVID-19. These include providing transparent assignments, which clearly outline the purpose of learning with step-by-step instructions and explicit criteria and rubrics, and also setting the tone of your syllabus with empathetic policies for late work. Now, this is not an excuse for all late work, but it is to formulate late policies that take into consideration the current climate and elevated stressors that contribute to tardiness. In addition to these methods, my research revealed two instructional strategies that significantly promote compassion in the classroom. Those are team-based learning and narratives or storytelling. Team-based learning has been called the flipped classroom and is a structured form of small group learning that emphasizes student preparation out of class and the application of knowledge inside the classroom. So students are organized into teams of 5 to 7 students that work together throughout the course. Students prepare by reading prior to class, and then once classes are together, they are quizzed on the material. Now, these tests can be generally multiple choice and can be graded easily. If you have an interactive classroom, you can even use platform or tools such as Slido, where students can answer questions from their cell phones. This allows for any areas of misconception to be addressed quickly. And then after, students are given a scenario to explore. The teacher then acts as a guide while teams work toward their solutions to the problem. This method encourages sophisticated critical thinking and collective problem solving. The act of collaboration builds empathy through shared challenges and shared victories. Commonalities are established, preconceptions are broken down, and a more nuanced understanding of the world and each other emerges. Narratives and storytelling are one of the oldest forms of teaching. We tell stories because it's a way to bond and connect with one another. According to professional storyteller Pedro Zepeda, storytelling promotes a sense of community and belonging, helps develop empathy and self-confidence, and facilitates learning. As a public service practitioner for over 30 years, I use narratives and storytelling from my experiences in the field, sharing insights and reflections. However, one of the best values of narratives and storytelling is empowering the voice of the student and allowing them to see their experiences as knowledge. One way of doing this is when introducing new topics, ask the students, what does this look like? Inform them that it is okay to use their own experiences. The goal is to create a relationship that supports intellectual risk and reinforces the feeling of belonging. While team-based learning and narrative storytelling foster compassion in the classroom, they also have the added benefit of promoting cultural competency as well. The goal of public service education is to produce individuals who are able to engage with the public competently and confidently. Team-based learning and narrative storytelling allows for the public service student to interact with new ideas and share experiences in a way that is easily transferable to the workplace. Public service professionals have the whole world in their hands. For the care they give to the world to be kind and compassionate, their treatment in our classrooms must also be. By implementing strategies that promote community, power sharing, and honors the lived experiences, we can create a better world, even in the midst of chaos. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Vickie. Such an interesting and insights, and also things that we should always keep in mind, whether it's COVID or not. Okay, we got you. You went right on the 10-minute time presentation. Next, we're gonna hear from Koffi Jean, the president of the Global Relief Fund for Education, with his presentation on governments, Adapt, Change, or Die. Jean, are you there? I saw you there earlier. And you are still muted.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Thank you. Thank you for giving me the time to present for the second time. Last year, I did a great presentations. And this year, my topic is a little bit not complex because we're going from the Hampton Roads to the, to actually talking about a global topic. And I want to talk about the future of government. The local government, state government, and the federal government in the US and possibly in the whole world. So this presentation is part of my one of my papers that I'm actually trying to turn into a book to benefit government to reflect on how they're going to recover after the COVID pandemic that hit most governments in the whole world. So I organized my talk into different 5 points. So first, in my introductions, I mentioned that changes in the geopolitical environment due to COVID-19 in the recent, 2020, forced government globally, particularly the United States of America, to adapt, change, or die. Also, I want to talk about the US, local and foreign policy landscape. And I mean that this public policy landscape is sick in many ways. So we need reforms in every aspect. And for me, it's time to actually analyze the weak point of the US government, the US foreign policy landscape, and also find a way to actually address those problems. The third point in my introduction is that the US policy needs to adapt to survive the rise of countries such as China and Russia. And these countries are making significant changes in Africa. And Africa is a strategic part of the US, Germany, maintenance. So for me, if the US wants to maintain its global influence, so the US has to maintain Africa. And actually, they have to deal with Russia and China. The second point of my talk is about the challenges that the federal government particularly is facing. And the first challenge is the erosion of trust in public institutions. And we have seen that since COVID, people and citizens in the US, do not trust the government for solutions. So they're trying to find ways to protect themselves because they believe that you have a conflict between scientists and political leaders. So we actually see this battle. And the second challenge is the lack of consistent source of revenue. Well, what I mean by that, maintaining a global influence is going to hit local governments and state government because the resources are going to use to support actually the US foreign policy ambitions. And the third challenge is a limited public-private cooperations. I mean, cooperation between US companies and global companies, I mean, companies in Africa. So let's move to my, the third part of my talk, where I mentioned the failures and some successes of the US foreign policy. So after the Cold War, I mean, the first Cold War ended. So let me go back to the Second World War. After the Second World War ended, so the US actually rebuilt Germany, accepted the Marshall Plan, and helped many companies and many governments in the world to recover from those crises. So those were some successes. And even in the African arena, for example, the US is missing a lot of things in the foreign policy area, where, I mean, the goals of the US for foreign policies are not in alignment actually with local government political leaders really want for the continent. So for me, it's time here for US to think how they're going to move the foreign policy goals to benefit both the US and also African governments. And actually I have a different paper where I actually lay out 10 different recommendations to actually survive, I mean, and what I call the challenges that the US is facing in the area. And we cannot think about this, I mean, this in isolation of what is going on. And I think that the US-led international liberal order is also facing challenges with those alliances that are actually trying to not be enforced in some of the stuff that they don't want. So this order is shaking, and it's for me, it's time for the US to retain this, I mean, to rebuild it. And doing this, local governments, state government are going to suffer because they are going to ask for money to local governments, the government to support the global agenda the US is trying to pursue. And also in terms of recommendations, my first point is that we need reform in the public and foreign policy landscape in the US, even abroad. And the first thing that you want to do, you want to promote transparency. Transparency. What I mean by transparency. So the goal of the public, what the public wants, what the political leader wants, we have to be able to find a common ground and see, okay, so the government wants this, after what the citizen wants. So once we agree on those aspects, of course, citizens are going to support the actual foreign policy area. And my second recommendation is that we need to increase diversity and inclusion effort in every aspect in government, especially in the foreign policy sphere. So, and in this case, I want to bring back Africa in the area. So, I wrote my other paper from an African perspective. How do we understand the US foreign policy? What do we want from this policy? What do our government want? And how can the US actually bring, African leaders to think in a different way so that this can actually benefit the US. And the last point I want to bring here is that leaders gathered, a few days ago to condemn, the action of the Russian government against Ukraine. And many African countries refused to condemn that. And for me, this is a clear message that the US foreign policy is going really in the wrong direction. And if nothing is done, countries like China and Russia are going to benefit more than the US abroad. And to conclude, here I want to speculate where we are headed if nothing is done. So I love this country, and in my other paper that I'm talking about, I propose, 5-phase plan, a plan with different 5 steps to actually rebuild the relation between US companies, the private sector in the US and the private sector in Africa. So whether in industrial area, in every sector. So again, to conclude here, what is happening today in Europe, in Ukraine, is affecting people here. So the price guys, the cost of gas is going up, and everybody's suffering right now. So what should we do? So what I mean is that state government, local government should not be in isolations when it comes to the US foreign policy area, because it's going to affect them in, even if they do nothing, they're going to suffer. We're doing nothing right now, but we're suffering because we are paying more than we used to pay for gas, even for food. So what I mean is that if nothing is done in this area, we are going to suffer. And for me, action is needed right now. And so I get involved and actually address these key problems. Thank you.
Thank you so much for this global perspective on the current things. And now moving from global back to local, we have Robin Dunbar, Deputy Director of Education at the Elizabeth River Project nonprofit. Robin, the floor is yours.
Hi, thank you. Let me see if I could, I tried to share a second ago. Let's see if I can do it. Tell me when you can see.
Yes, we can see it.
Okay, there we go. So yep, I am your nonprofit person today, and I'm real excited to tell you a little bit about what I do. So the Elizabeth River Project has been around for 30 years. I've been with the organization over 22 years. I grew up here around the Elizabeth, and the Elizabeth River is Old Dominion University's home river. So it runs through 4 cities, Norfolk, Portsmouth, Chesapeake, and Virginia Beach. And I am absolutely an ODU alum. And I'm the Deputy Director of Education for this nonprofit that is the sole voice and source that is working to clean this Elizabeth River. So with that, this is a map of the river. Can you see my arrow, by the way? Okay, this is a map of the Elizabeth River watershed. ODU is right here, located near the mouth of the river that empties into Hampton Roads, and then the bay, and then the Atlantic Ocean. If you head about this direction, we connect to the James River, and then over this way, the Nansemond. But you can come anywhere in the world by vessel, and you can come through the Elizabeth River like a super highway and eventually end up in Florida. So we have a really unique river, and I appreciate Dr. Carnegie's storytelling, love, because I'm going to kind of tell you the journey through COVID and how this perfect storm kind of happened with me. So just to back up just a teeny bit, back in 2019, I was awarded from the White House and from the National Science Foundation this award right here, which is a STEM award, and it's also for mentoring. And I won that based on this vessel behind me called the Learning Barge that I created, and I was educating a lot of students. So I was seeing about 30,000 students a year through all these 4 cities. So they come onto this one-of-a-kind floating classroom. I'm going to show you a little bit more about that. And what happened is when I won this award, I was whisked down to the White House, and there were 14 of us that had won this award in the nation. And the National Science Foundation met with us and said, so how are you going to leverage this prestigious award? So I said, you know, they went from person to person. Well, every single one of the award winners was already a tenured professor at a university. I was the only one sitting there with a bachelor's degree representing a nonprofit. So when they came to me, I said, well, I guess I'm going back to school. So that's what I did. So to bring this into perspective, that was 2019. And then we were faced, you know, with COVID. So I was in student mode. And with that, I went back for my master's, and I started bringing in my love for education and this river. This river has a score of about a C if you were to give it a grade. We are one of the most polluted rivers of the Chesapeake Bay. We're located at the bottom of the bay. So being so close to the bay and then the ocean, we're very salty. We have the same kind of animals that you'd see in the ocean, from dolphin to seahorses to jellyfish, blue crab. But we're also, again, the most polluted river on the bay, and we have the highest sea level rise. We have made a lot of progress. We've gone from a failing grade to a C. And we are also a living river. So we have beautiful wildlife, but we're also this industrialized working river. So if you're stuck in traffic, it's probably because you're trying to go through a tunnel or over a bridge around the Elizabeth River. But there's very little public access. So when I came on board to the Elizabeth River Project with my bachelor's from ODU, I immediately began to get children connected to their home river, because you can't see it unless you're stuck in traffic. And with that, I started also teaching about resilience in the changing climate and sea level rise. So if you're not aware, the Elizabeth River has the highest sea level rise, meaning Norfolk and Portsmouth, on the East Coast of the United States. So the students, meaning pre-K through 12 and university, they have frequent flooding even when it's not raining now. And they're very used to not being able to get to where they need to go because of all these floodwaters. Well, again, bringing you back to 2020 now, I'm now back in history working on my master's. And I wanted to focus for the first time on litter and marine debris. For my career at the Elizabeth River Project, we had spent years focusing on things that you can't see. So looking at the water quality, looking at the salinity and the pH and the chemistry of the river. And they weren't really focused on whatever's floating on the surface, what's landed in the wetlands, or what's sunk to the bottom. And I was like, well, if I'm going back to school, I want to do something that I haven't been able to focus on. Well, when COVID happened, everybody started looking at all the litter. It just was this perfect timing. And so I started to focus on that at school at ODU, and I started bringing it into the education with the Elizabeth River Project. So with that, volunteers started coming by boat, cleaning up the river with me, and people started asking me more and more about what I'm seeing. Well, what I discovered with my master's at ODU is that I was seeing what a lot of people were talking about, all these plastics. But what I was also seeing is a lot of the fishing gear. So this is an owl that his wing has been captured at night on a fishing line that was caught in a tree. So I've learned through my research that Ocean Conservancy found through a lot of scholarly work that fishing gear is the #1 deadliest issue going on with our oceans and our bodies of water. So I immediately connected with our local rehab and rescuers of wildlife, and we weren't talking. Meaning before, there wasn't this focus. And so we were looking at the chemistry of the river. We just weren't talking to the rehabbers. So I reached out and I said, hey, I'm monitoring the river, especially by ODU. I'm seeing fishing line. I'm seeing all these plastics. Our local wildlife being impacted. And they said they could not keep up with the amount of calls coming in between the bats and all the birds and the turtles and so forth being impacted by the plastics and the litter and the fishing gear. So I started making these connections, and I started kind of bringing this area of overlap between what I was doing at ODU with my research with what I was doing at work. So at the same time, I knew it was really important to keep kids outside during COVID. And we wanted to also keep our businesses that were doing projects to help the river outside also. So what you're seeing here with the businesses, the staff were out putting these oyster castles. They're just these cement castles that are put together, and they create artificial oyster reefs. So they were building reefs. And if you didn't know, oysters naturally filter out 5 gallons of water a day, one oyster. And so that was naturally what was happening in the past, cleansing the river. Over time, what happened is we were taking the oysters out and building our first roads with them, our streets and our roads. And we just didn't know to put the shells back. So eventually nature wasn't cleansing the river anymore. And so now we have community students in all ages oyster harvesting, putting these oysters back. And now the Elizabeth River has more oyster reefs than any other river on the bay. So we were doing that. We were rebuilding the shoreline. So here are these oyster castles, and then we're putting back all these beautiful native grasses to help with the floodwaters. And then what I was noticing with my research is these beautiful grasses were trapping all the litter and debris floating in because we're tidal. So I would go into this area and you couldn't see it, and the average person doesn't have access to it, but I was seeing that hidden within these wetlands was a whole bunch of trash, and it was impacting the wildlife. So it all kind of started coming together. And at the same time, we had big industries doing big things with these living shorelines. So here, this is now a big oyster reef, and this is property owned by Norfolk Southern. And they decided to, during COVID, restore this huge shoreline and have won a lot of awards for it. So we had all ages doing things, but my focus was the youth and the education. So I was in contact with environmental educators all over the nation. And I kept hearing a lot of people saying they were going to take a pause. They were just not going to provide environmental education during COVID. And because ODU already had me outside, along with what I do with the nonprofit, it just didn't feel right to me. So I had to figure out how to keep kids and teachers outside during COVID. So I turned my barge into a barge on wheels here, and I started going out into the communities. Now, I kind of took a risk because I wasn't sure if I was going to get negative press and feedback that I was going into communities during COVID, but it ended up being a blessing, and it ended up being something that was very positively received. So we brought these little cute COVID blue crab masks for the kids and the teachers. We kept them at my nature park. We did virtual training online. The kids still did environmental projects. I created a new youth citizen water monitoring so that they could get out if they live near the river and monitor the water. I created a new program called River Leaders for university students to help with the trash. And then we kept volunteers helping cleaning. And then I also portrayed Princess Elizabeth and did storytelling virtually. So we kept it going. Now, the difference was as my numbers went from 30,000 a year to more like 3,000. But it didn't bother me because I knew that every child that I could get outdoors, it was really important for them to keep breathing and keep moving and connected to nature. It's very healing. So this is the learning barge. It's now 10 years old. And you can see how the students, they come aboard. This is located right now docked in Norfolk at Grandy Village, right in the middle of a area with the housing projects, and it's also the epicenter of flooding. So they come on, they rotate through stations, they get a close-up look at what's living in the river, they do science, and they touch the river and use all their senses. So here you can see that we bring up and talk about what we see during the day. We kept it going. The teachers and the students wore masks, we did social distancing, and we still made it fun. We also, if they couldn't come to us, we went to them. It's kind of a mini version of what they experience on the learning barge. And instead of going around to different stations on the barge, we actually designed the van so that it serves as a teaching platform too. So this is a particular side where we teach about renewable energy with solar panels, and the kids, we go right into their schools, into their parking lots. The teachers were really fantastic. We saw all of Chesapeake fourth graders during the fall. Now we're getting ready to see all of Norfolk's third grade. And so they would rotate in small groups around the van. And we also went on TV, had a lot of press, and it's just been a really powerful program. At the same time, we brought people to the park, and we didn't even really have to tell people to come to the park. People started coming. They wanted a place to get outdoors, to social distance, to move and breathe and reconnect to nature. Mm-hmm. And so this is in Portsmouth, and you can walk around the entire park area. These are, we brought this back. We put $20 million into restoring this along with businesses, and it's called Paradise Creek Nature Park. It's near the Jordan Bridge. You'll see that over here. And although we're in Portsmouth, over here is Chesapeake, and then this way is Norfolk, over that way. So you can take a kayak, launch a kayak, and go through these mazes of wetlands and out into the river. You can walk it. We have one of the last standing forests here, and it's just been really powerful. This is kind of what it looks like at the level of kayaking through the maze, and we hope you'll continue to come out and visit us. And then we presented new programs like Forest School. And remember those owls I told you that were injured? We had the group, it's called Nature's Nanny, who rescues the animals. And they brought some of the animals out, and the kids got to see them. So this was an owl that they had rescued. They brought out osprey, they brought out an eagle, they brought out a hawk, and the kids social distance and got to meet some of these. They played around in the forest and moved around, and you can see here they just gathered sticks. We call this our bed and breakfast at the park. This transforms all the time because the kids come out and rebuild and do things with nature. But at the same time, we had to refocus and adapt to how we offered some of our programs. One is, for years, we've recognized schools' grades for doing projects. And we had to get our grantors on board to support, instead of a grade doing it, one child or a family, or a teacher and a child, and that worked. And so this, we still had all the schools participating, but we were now able to recognize even if it was just one child. And so they continued to do projects from plantings to water science to litter cleanup. And here they even greened a schoolyard. You can see this is what it used to look like when you walked in the door. And now they refocused and went all green. Over all the kids, 600 kids helped green their schoolyard. And then what we did was, instead of having an in-person expo where the kids shared their projects, we did a virtual one. And we've had some amazing speakers. This was an astronaut from NASA that was a keynote. So transferring over to virtual has also been a plus. And then at the same time, we had donors still giving during that time. One would have not seen this, but during COVID, we were able to raise $20 million through a capital campaign, which was pretty phenomenal. And with that, they wanted us to have a larger building to be able to offer more education for the community and the kids. So this is our groundbreaking is in 2 weeks, where all my education staff is located. And then that's in Portsmouth at the park. And then in Norfolk, we have another building called the Resilience Lab that will be located across the street from ODU's ICAR. And we will be working together. And this is a resilience lab. 20 million came in for that also, and groundbreaking will take place in a month and a half for that. We already have the community doing science and chemistry located here on a dock on that property. So I have continued my research, and now I'm working on my PhD. Dr. Yusuf is my advisor, and she's phenomenal. But I wanted to just share that even though it wasn't planned, I had no idea COVID was coming. It was really beneficial that I was a student at ODU and continuing learning before COVID came, because it allowed me to be able to transfer over to what I needed to for the students in the community, and to also see this issue going on with marine debris and pollution that became so highlighted with all the additional plastics and the single-use items during this time. So I want to thank you for allowing me to share this, and I hope you get to learn more about the Elizabeth River Project and what we do. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Robin. This is so fascinating that you were able not to just continue your work, but also expand it to the next level. Thank you. And last but not least, we have Dr. Stephen King with his leadership lessons from crisis situations. Stephen, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Marina. Robin's presentation is going to be extremely difficult to follow. Mine is going to be extremely boring in comparison to hers, but I will give it a shot. This is a presentation that emanates from a piece that I published in Public Integrity. It's also a smaller portion of 2 other research projects that I'm engaging in at this point, also one of them being a book. And the centerpiece of it is examining ethical leadership in crisis situations. And I think the COVID pandemic and the particular context of the New York's COVID-19 nursing home executive order by former Governor Andrew Cuomo is a great place to start. So very quickly, and I want to move quickly because I do want to get to the crux of the piece. There's ethical leadership, as any descriptor of leadership is going to be challenged in terms of a definition. In fact, even leadership itself is challenged as to what kind of a definition is an appropriate one for that. But we'll look at some of the more common forms and accepted forms of definitions of leadership. And specifically then, how is ethical leadership revealed, impactful during some form of a crisis situation? A second question came as I was actually not going to move in this direction, but one of the reviewers in the review stage of the manuscript was suggesting that there may be a relationship between the practice of ethical leadership and the development and practice of leadership competencies and skills. And so I'm not necessarily saying that I have developed a model that is going to show that relationship, although I think intuitively we can see that there is a relationship. And then finally, what are the implications for the practice of ethical leadership and demonstration, particularly in the public sector and perhaps even also obviously during a crisis situation. So again, you can read, I'm not going to go through all of these particular definitions, but just to highlight a few of these, ethical leadership is going to encompass a large number of different descriptors or defining means, depending upon the construct or the context or the framework. Within a crisis situation, I think it is certainly going to be values such as responsibility, the aspect of developing virtue, More importantly, I think, and probably well-meaning here, is the development of relationships, which actually comes back to all of our presentations in some way, shape, or form, is that during a crisis situation, it's very important to maintain a relational component, obviously between leader and follower, but between leader, follower, and organization, institution, and then the greater population as a whole. And if we can do that, we can continue to engage in solid leadership overall, and specifically ethical leadership. So how is ethical leadership expressed during a particular during a particular crisis? What I did is I chose the State of New York's nursing home executive order situation as a means to try to explore this particular aspect, and I'll look at that in a little bit more detail. I used two separate models. One model was James McGregor Burns' 1978 moral transforming model, in which he really developed the whole concept of transformational leadership juxtaposed to transactional leadership. For him, a morally transforming model of leadership would be one in which there is a mobilization of people and resources, a satisfaction of the follower, the leader-follower relationship, which has oftentimes been overlooked, but is now becoming much more prevalent in the leadership. And of course, the achievement of goals. All leaders strive to achieve goals, and therefore the motive has to be altruistic in the sense of a leadership, ethical leadership, and the behavior then ought to be more selfless and virtuous if you're engaging in that kind of leadership. But at the same time, if something is morally transforming, the other component would be, are they competent and are they skillful? It's one thing to engage in one, but not the other, and we're not going to be as equally effective. So I looked at Van Wart and Capucio's crisis competency model, which does not fit necessarily perfectly with a pandemic in this sense, but they did highlight, I think it was 39 different competencies and skills, and they were looking at these in terms of crisis management. They weren't labeling them as crisis leadership. And I chose these 8 particular competencies and skills that I think could be reflective within any kind of a crisis situation. The idea would be then, how might they be reflective in a leadership crisis, i.e. a ethical leadership context. So this is really more of a descriptive analysis. The methodology is a case study in component. And the idea was, to what extent is there not a relationship between ethical and moral leadership, and any actions or inactions identified in these leadership competencies and skills. And so I'm using a case study narrative, including the use of academic literature, also a substantial amount of journalistic stories, because they were pertinent to developing the narratives from each of the 3 leaders that I'll identify in a moment, various government documents and various reported statements of the 3 leaders themselves. So there are 3 particular important leaders that I chose in this one. Of course, Governor Andrew Cuomo was the first. If you look at the morally transforming model juxtaposed to the crisis competencies model, and again, I'm not making an argument that there is a direct relationship between these particular contexts or aspects of ethical leadership and competencies, but it's very interesting that they do highlight themselves here. He was very strong in terms of mobilization of his staff and resources, engaged in a variety of daily public briefings, even to the point of using extensive presentational means and modes. His original decision in executing the nursing home order, which was came about at the end of March of 2020, it was stopped at the mid-May of 2020, was his argument was that it was to serve the needs of the greater public, that is, freeing hospital space to accommodate what his administration assumed to be a very large influx of the sick during that particular time. Actually, and thankfully it was not at that particular time, but it later became effective later on. His crisis, under the crisis competency models, he was making decisions to initiate executive orders with a great deal of self-confidence. He was very confident in his original decision was correct, despite a lot of public condemnation and public data to the opposite. Some claim that he did act responsibly by ultimately rescinding that executive order in May of 2020. Very quickly, the New York Department of Health Commissioner Howard Zucker, former Commissioner Howard Zucker now, he was a model of the public administrator. a public health administrator, a morally transforming model according to the Burns model. He set aside personal political interests for the promotion of the greater public good. He was following, to a great extent, many of the particular components that we would find in the ASPA Code of Ethics. He was developing and empowering his staff. He was displaying excellent communication skills, whether through oral communication theories or his written statements. He was acting very responsibly. He was being very resilient during this particular period of time. And he was remained intent on providing up-to-date and accurate information on the deaths and the spread of the virus. My third component, leader is really more of a nurse manager. Her name is Stephanie Gilmore. I did some research and looking at various aspects and the impact upon the nursing home, and her name consistently came up in a variety of ways. She would be what we would refer to as a street level bureaucrat. The particular nursing home she operated out of was a nonprofit. There are some 400 nursing homes throughout the state of New York, both profit, nonprofit, and public. And Stephanie Gilmore was the quintessential street level bureaucrat. She was on the spot and she was being impacted and impacting this particular situation. That is the influx of COVID patients into a nursing home context. She was just demonstrating an understanding, empathy for the decisional dilemma, as she called it, the governor had as to whether or not he should execute this mandate and move individuals from one set of hospitals to other nursing homes. She was setting aside her own personal, professional interests for needs and interests of others. This was particularly true of not only the patients, but the family of the patients and her own co-workers, those who were working with her and for her. She was acting very decisively. She was actually raising the attention of this growing problem, which the nursing home that she was referring to was her own, and Diamond Hill, which is in upstate New York. And she was saying, we have a problem. We do not have the staff and the resources necessary to do it. She was using her communication skills, both emails to superiors, as well as moving to outside state and local health officials, and even using the local media. Her intention was not to be combative, but her intention was to let individuals know that this is a growing problem. So she was being resilient, steadfast in her commitment to work and challenging this very challenging situation. And I'm doing this very quickly because I do want to leave open opportunities for questions. But I think what we really come down to was that in the case of Governor Cuomo, politics and ideological persuasions were certainly front and center. There was no doubt about it that he was using his platform as an opportunity to promote through an executive order an intent to try to decrease what he believed was going to be ultimately a wave of the COVID and ultimately hospitalizations and fatalities. And he wanted to make sure that those hospitals were open. And so he was moving that. But at the same time as he was moving that, he was moving them into situations where they were going to be greatly impacted and greatly affected. And so most of you know the numbers. By the end of May, there were somewhere between 3,000 and 4,000 by mid deaths in these nursing homes in the state of New York. By mid-July of 2020, by the end of August, we were pushing 10,000 to 12,000. And we've seen recent data come out of the Attorney General's office in the state of New York, most recently a few months ago, in which there was probably a 50% undercount as to the number of deaths within the nursing homes themselves. So he was under a tremendous amount of pressure, but others would simply say that it was a wrong decision to make in the first place, that is to initiate the mandate and do the move. Howard Zucker is the sort of the quintessential public servant, the public health servant. He follows an administrative oath of all public health servants. He himself is a medical doctor, as is Nurse Gilmore. She's a practicing nurse. Their goal is to serve, to protect, and promote the greater public good. This was fully on display in both of their cases. They were adhering to their professional ethics standards and remaining committed to addressing the problem and finding solutions. So crises such as the pandemic that we had requires these protocols to be in place and commitment to follow these protocols. But it also requires leaders, particularly those leaders who espouse to involve and impact their organizations and institution in an ethical and moral way, to be very flexible in order to be able to face changing circumstances, data, and impact. And I think at that point, we find this intersection between competency, being able to be flexible, being able to be resilient, being able to be communicative, being able to be engaging relationally, but at the same time, committing yourself to being in an ethical state. That is making sure that relationships are developed, making sure that in an order to engage in a stewardship situation, engaging in a situation in which you're empathetic to what is taking place and how it's taking place. So there's no easy method to say an ethical leader is always a competent leader or a competent leader is always an ethical leader, but there certainly is intersection between the two. So I think ultimately there are some implications that go beyond this particular context. We still need to get a firmer and more definitive hand upon what we mean by ethical leadership. And also we need to look more methodologically intent upon the relationship between ethical leadership and a competent or effective leadership. We know that ethical leaders have a positive impact upon relations, upon organizations, upon purposes, but to what degree are ethical leaders also engaging in competent leadership, leadership and skills that are being reflective of that ethical leadership, and or vice versa. So I think we're going to have to use more sophisticated technologies than the simple descriptive analysis in order to address those issues. So with that, I'll stop.
Thank you, Stephen. Very interesting findings there. So now we have a couple of minutes left at our panel. So I will like to open up the floor for any questions to our four wonderful presenters. You can just simply unmute yourself. I think we're in a relatively small group where we can just be a lot more interactive here.
Hey, Maria, this is Gary. Again, I appreciate all the excellent presentations, and I know we don't have a lot of time for questions, but I was just particularly struck just on a personal level by Robin's presentation as somebody who is so sensitive to the adverse effects of pollution and other such objects on wildlife. And you see the effect personally up here, whether you're actually on the ocean or in our lakes and ponds. I think another major problem that I have just when I clean up trash in my neighborhood is people don't realize how damaging cigarette butts are, to the actual environment, and how nicotine and all the chemicals in that not only affects the waterways and the wildlife, but also adversely affects the productivity of plants and just the fertility of the soils. So I haven't seen a lot of emphasis, on programs that address the problem of cigarette butts, but it's a big issue. I thought, was one of you any thoughts or reflections on that?
Yeah, thanks for bringing that up. So in Virginia, our organization that really focuses on marine debris is called Clean Virginia Waterways. It's run by Executive Director Katie Register out of Longwood University. And so she was one of my committee members on my master's. And on that site, you'll see that the top items, 20 items that volunteers usually find. It used to be aluminum cans, but that switched over time. But cigarettes has always stayed up there. But the top 10 now are related to plastics and food items. So one of the things that I see all the time now is not so much cigarettes, but those plastic filters. Yeah. They're beige, and because they're all beige, the same color, it catches your eye when you're doing cleanups. It still remains an impact, but there was a lot of focus that also is now going as far as research to microplastics, the little itty bitty teeny breakdown of items. So there's just I'm looking at macro debris, things that you can see, that kids can see, that the public can see, things that are hidden, out of sight, out of mind. But we are still seeing cigarettes, but not to the degree that we are seeing a lot of the food items and the plastics.
Well, that's good news, but they're still annoying. I know they're dangerous, but thank you.
Thank you, Gary. Anyone else? Celeste? Yes, go ahead.
Sure. I just wanted to say everybody did a great job. I really enjoyed everybody's presentation. And I do have a question too for Robin. We met at a conference when you were dressed up like Elizabeth, and I just, what you do is just amazing. And I just had a question because when you said that the top item is fishing gear, has there been any outreach to the fishing organizations to, focus on their impact? Because sometimes, in our family, there's avid fishermen, and, sometimes they have to cut lines and just not realizing that, is a huge impact. I just wanted to ask that real quick.
Yeah, so it's the deadliest item, by the way. So
yes.
With that, there's a movement to create, how can I explain it? You can recycle line, and people are creating these bins out of PVC pipes, and they attach them to where fishing spots are, hot spots. And if a line breaks, fishermen can now take and put the line in these bins. So there is a movement to help with that. But then you've got fishermen that fish, or fisher people that fish in places that don't have those, of course, also. And there's also a new fishing line that is actually, it's barbed. So it creates even a worse danger to our wildlife. So it was created so that when you cast out a line, the line doesn't tangle up. And it's got these frays in the line, but the line that doesn't have that is safer for an animal if it got caught in it than this barbed line. The barbed line eats and cuts into the animals more. So we have brand new issues going on. And where it gets caught is wherever fishermen are throwing their lines and there's trees. So if you go, there's a park specifically in Chesapeake that you can go. And the only reason it catches your eyes is because fishing line has these fluorescent floating pieces that are attached to the fishing line, so you can see where it's floating. But if you look up in the trees and you're really looking for it, it actually looks like Christmas tinsel. And what happens is our birds aren't programmed at night to say, oh, let me avoid all the fishing line that's hanging everywhere. They don't know. And so when they're hunting at night, like owls, they just get caught in it.
Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you. Any other questions?
Robin, obviously you must have a substantial, solid relationship with local governments, local and county governments. To what degree do you receive any challenges to what you're trying to do? I'll just leave it at that. Do you get any pushback, or is there any, I mean, it may be pushback in a good way, but it may be challenges to the degree that it's going to cost you more money, or it's going to cost more person hours and time, or worse, they may not simply be on target with what you're doing.
Was this to me? Did you say Robin?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, no, we have the Elizabeth River Project has not had a pushback. We have a philosophy of not pointing fingers, and we're the collaboration model actually of the nation of how we're cleaning the Elizabeth River. So we have people come to the table. We have a watershed action plan, and it involves all sectors. And right now we're working on I guess this is strategic plan number 5. It's called a watershed action plan, has over 150 stakeholders, all levels of government, public, private, military, industry. And we recognize them for coming and doing the best they can versus suing them or pointing fingers. So we're a collaborative model. And it's been a joy working for this project. And we have not had pushback.
Okay, I think oh, yes, go ahead.
Okay. Robin, I would think educational information could be handed out when people get their licenses.
I like that idea.
They all got to get a license.
I will say though, more people are transitioning online versus standing in line at DMV.
Well, I meant fishing license.
Oh, fishing license.
Yes.
I thought, fishing. Yes. We have, we're actually starting 2 new programs. One is getting the community to learn to fish. And so we're going to be doing that on the barge and at our new buildings at the park and this resilience lab. And then we are working with local fisher groups. We sure are. Thank you.
Thank you so much for all the interesting questions and the wonderful presentations.